Okay, Lucy.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Lucy Andrews, and I am so glad to be here. I'm from the AWA, the American Women of Aquitaine Club. So, shout out to our club, small but mighty in the south of France. Right now, I'm in California. Um, and I will be back in France in a few weeks. So I'm really excited to be here. We'll have time for questions at the end or comments, but we'll record this and you'll have access, I think, to the PowerPoint. So, because there's some things that like I put in there that we won't necessarily go through item by item, but we will. So let's go ahead and get started. And thank you to Mary for helping me navigate. We were having some few little technical issues this morning, always, right? So here we go. So let's get started. So today I want to talk about something that affects all of us, right? Aging, and not just about our lifespan, but our health span and how we can really age well so that we're in our 90s, we are able to open that jar of peanut butter, or we can, do a nice walk with our family. So the big question is, how do we do that? How do we really make the years that we have left really count? And that's the whole goal of what we're going to talk about today. So, Mary, if you could do the next slide. Thank you. So first, I wanted to define the difference between lifespan and health span. And we know that our lifespan is the total number of years lived. Our health span, however, is different. It's the number of years that we live actively in good health and free from chronic disease and disability. So picture this, picture two 80-year-olds. One is active and independent and going to go walk the Camino. And the other one is frail and struggling with daily tasks and on many medications. And what is the difference? So it's not just luck and it's not just genetics. It's really about how we can live now as we're younger to prepare ourselves for our health span as well as our lifespan. Unfortunately, we know modern medicine tends to they can expand our lifespan, but health span, if you kind of think of it as our quality of life, many people spend the last decade or more of their life in a decline, in an infirmity. And what we're trying to avoid is to shrink that time of disability as we near the end of our life. So next slide, please. So our lifespan, I just want to go over just to put things in perspective for you. So in the early 1900s in Europe, the lifespan was about 47 years. Now it's quite a bit more than that, double almost. And in Europe, women reach the average about 83.8 years is the average lifespan. And we know that there's things that have really contributed: medical care, improvement in sanitation, antibiotics, vaccines, better nutrition. Unfortunately, though, health span has not really kept up with the increase in our lifespan. So what our job is as we age is to really increase those years of healthy life and decrease those years of infirmary. So let me show you the next slide, and it will give you just a graph of lifespan and health span. And you can see that the second column are European women, and they're done the best of everyone. They have the longest lifespan, and they have a little edge on American women on their health span. So this is just a quick graph to kind of show you that. Next slide, please. So in this slide, we talk about the differences. Well, we know there's a few things that are different between the US and the EU. And the main ones are related to diet, exercise, and all the things we're going to talk about today. So in the US, we see lots of processed food, very low fiber. You know, we eat a lot of prepared, pre-mixed, and large amounts of food. In Europe, most are more whole foods. Many follow a more of a Mediterranean diet. And it's always exciting to me when I get back home in France and I eat a more normalized portion instead of these huge portions. The US has a very sedentary lifestyle. We drive everywhere in the US. And it's funny because I have an Apple Watch and it always tells me when I'm in the US, seems like you've walked up less stairs than you normally do. So it's a much more active culture in the EU. And the reason I'm telling you all these is that we can take some solace in living in the EU, that we have some better things that help us with our health span. Our focus on health span and prevention is a little bit better in the EU than in the US. Right now in the US, we really, our medical care is really disease driven, right? So as long as you're fine, you don't really interact with your healthcare system as much as maybe we should be. But in the EU, they tend to do a more comprehensive preventative processes with a little bit more of early intervention. And our social and mental, I say in France, in the US, we live to work, and in France, we work to live. And so to me, that's a huge differentiation. And even though sometimes when I'm trying to get some construction project done, that makes me crazy because they're like, nope, holiday today, nope, bank day today. But the things that make me crazy are also the same things that led me to be in France and to enjoy that kind of lifestyle. Next slide, please, Mary. So what happens? How do we lose our health span as we age? Well, part of the issue is that chronic diseases dominate our aging. These are really silent progressions of diseases that start to really develop decades before they show any symptoms. And these include our heart disease and stroke, which are worldwide the leading causes of death. Type 2 diabetes is strongly linked to metabolic dysfunction and often diagnosed not until, every time I go to the doctor in the US, they say, oh, we're going to check and see if you're pre-diabetic. And then if you are, they're like, yeah, okay, well, we're not going to do anything until you're diabetic. And so these are problems that we need to self-advocate for. Dementia. We talked last fall about dementia, Alzheimer's, and how we see those brain changes years in advance from where we actually see symptoms. And our osteoporosis and fractures. I recently had a fall here and I thought, man, I better start to really work on my stability and balance, because these declines in our functional status, we're going to talk about a little bit more in a few slides, but it really starts to impact us. And before we know it, it's like, I can't open the jar. So how do these kinds of things happen? So number one is these chronic diseases start to show themselves, manifest in physical and other ways as we age. And the older we get, the more we start to see these start to show themselves in our lives. Next slide, please. So the second one is by the time people are 65, most adults have at least one chronic condition. So many of these have many comorbidities. So oftentimes they come in pairs. So because they're all intertwined. So if you're having metabolic issues, you may also not be as easy. It may not be as easy for you to go out and exercise. So we start to see this kind of cascade of events that start to happen. And even though it feels like it's kind of this sudden decline, like, oh my gosh, I can't do what I used to do, in truth, it happens gradually. And that's where we can come in to really change that process earlier on. So next slide, please. And that leads us to this side, that aging begins earlier than we think. We think, oh, in our 30s and 40s, and even in our 50s. I was so busy working during that time, I didn't really pay any attention to the thought of aging, other than I worked in that industry, but I didn't think about it for my own health and what it could really, what happens. So we know things like muscle wasting and muscle loss start early in our lives, sometimes even in our 50s. These kinds of things lead to poor balance, frailty. We see the metabolic decline, insulin resistance, and you hear a lot about it now when we start to see different drugs that are really beginning to help insulin resistance, like the GLP-1 drugs. But these kinds of things start to gradually take hold of us, and belly fat, inflammation, heart disease, our ability to take in a deep breath declines. All these things start to influence our aging. And what we know about the decline in our aging is that it goes, it's a gradual process that goes downhill. And while we can intervene, some of it happens just because we're older. And so our job, again, is to counterbalance this. So the fourth one, in the next slide, please, is most people don't notice this stuff. Like I said, I was in my 50s, I'm working away, and I didn't have any symptoms, right? I thought I was doing fine. But sedentary lifestyle, bad dietary choices, all those kinds of things are things that really start to impact us. And all of a sudden, it seems like I can't open the jar. But the reality is I was losing my grip strength well over time. I just really didn't pay any attention to it because I could still get by, I could still do it. But I didn't realize that there's so many of these subtle things that really start to make a difference, until all of a sudden I realized I can't open the jar of peanut butter. So next slide, please. So what we need to do is figure out a way how we can bridge the gap between our lifespan and our health span. So we've talked about all the things that can go wrong. So the best outcome, and what we really want, is for our living longer and maintaining our good health throughout this process for your extended years of your life. So you can get on the floor when you're 90 and play with your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren. So we can go on that walk. And the goal is to really have this compression of morbidity. And that really means that how we can start to shrink that time of illness. Next slide, please, Mary. So I want to talk about this concept. So this concept, the compression of morbidity, was coined by Dr. James Fries. He was a professor at Stanford University, and he kind of came up with this terminology in 1980. And his theory said that by delaying the onset of chronic diseases and disabilities through healthy lifestyle choices, we can shrink that period of morbidity and illnesses and push it off as long as we can. So instead of spending 10 or 15 years in decline, we can do that for a much smaller, very brief amount of time. And some of the things that are easy to do is, focus on our diet. Exercise, sleep, social engagement are probably the four biggest things. And if you heard me in the fall, you may go, wow, this sounds like that same thing. And it's funny because many of the things that we help with our brains and making sure our brains are good actually help our whole health span. So it's really important to try and have that goal to compress our morbidity and to really be kind of have that centenarian decathlon, getting to that endpoint in its best health as we can. So, next slide, please. How can we improve this? What do we do? Well, we talked briefly about it. So the strategies for a long health span are amazingly genetics, our aging are part of it, but there are many things that we can do that can make a huge impact to our health span. Exercise, metabolic and nutritional health, our sleep. None of us pay enough attention to our sleep. Our emotional and cognitive health, and knowing where you stand. So using your blood work, your lab values, to actually help us get a baseline, to know what we should focus on and how we can move the needle on those things through using these other four things: exercise, metabolic health, sleep, and emotional and cognitive health, to really help set the stage for our aging. So the next few slides are all about the key biomarkers that can really help us detect risk and optimize our health span. So there's 3 pages of these. I'm not going to go through them all, but I will say these first ones are probably the most important to look at your overall kind of health span in a nutshell. So we want to look at, instead of looking at our overall cholesterol, looking at our APOB is probably a better indicator of our health disease than LDL cholesterol. And triglycerides also help us understand where we are with our cardiac health. Our C-reactive protein gives us the idea of our overall body inflammation. It doesn't tell us where we're having an inflammatory response, but it will show us where we are. And our HB A1C, we hear about that on commercials all the time, right? If you are in the US, we don't hear it so much in Europe, but in the US, they're all about, lowering your A1C. And that is really important for us because it gives us a picture of our blood sugar and tells us really our risk for diabetes. And then kind of an overall lipid panel. So if you were going to pick just a few that you'd want to focus on, I'd probably pick these first. Many times when you go to your provider, you have to ask for them. And most of the times they'll agree. Or if you say, look, I need a baseline, I'm not going to ask you over and over again, but let's get a baseline on these. And hopefully your provider will comply. So the next two slides are, again, different labs. I won't go through all of them because you can read them and you'll have the PowerPoint to look if you are interested. And the next one is, again, related to just additional ones. If you're in perimenopause, it's always good to get your estradiol and progesterone levels, and because we want to see where our bone health is. I asked my doctor for this, and he just kind of looked at me and he goes, well, it's going to be low because you're a postmenopausal woman. I'm like, yes, but I still want it. I want to see where I'm at. So advocating is probably part of our biggest challenge, is making sure that we are our own advocates for our health. Okay, so the next strategy I want to talk about is movement and our strength. We're going to talk again after that. We're going to talk about nutrition, how we can optimize our energy, sleep. Most times we don't really pay much attention to our sleep, especially if we're working and we've got family obligations, or we're that sandwich generation where we're caring for our elderly parents and we have young adults or teenage kids. We don't spend enough time advocating to ourselves for ourselves. And then finally, really looking at our emotional and cognitive health. So let's move on to the next slide and talk really about strategies. So one of the biggest predictors of our longevity and our health span is exercise. And we know, and there's so much research out there that shows us that exercise is one of the biggest predictors of both of these things. Aerobic exercise decreases mortality, it strengthens ourselves, it prevents frailty, it helps with our risk of falls, it helps with our balance, it helps with our overall strength. So when I look at where I want to be at 90, I want to be able to get up off the floor. I want to be able to go on a walk with my kids and my grandkids. I want to be able to live independently, which means I need to be able to open the jar of peanut butter. And I need to be able to have the strength, the physiologic strength to do that. And that's where our VO2 max comes in. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. But interestingly enough, one of the newest indicators that people use is grip strength now. And so when we talk about that, we talk about really, can I open that jar? And it is amazingly one of the best indicators of how well we're going to age. So let's go on to the next slide. So I want to talk about our VO2 max for a minute, because it's not an exercise test that you can get easily through your doctor unless you have some problem with your respirations, or you have some chronic lung disease that they'll ask for that. Or if you're an athlete and you go, it's kind of a rigorous training. But our Apple Watches and many apps that we use to monitor our health or how many steps we're walking on can give us a good ballpark of this. And what it really is, it's the measurement of how well your body uses oxygen during intense exercise. And why do we care? Well, it represents your aerobic fitness, and it's often used to gauge our cardiovascular endurance. So if you want to be able to go on a walk with your grandkids and you're 90, you're going to have enough cardiovascular endurance to do that. And so we think of it this way. Think if your muscles need oxygen to produce energy, and your heart and lungs work to get that oxygen to your muscles. And your VO2 max tells you how much oxygen your body can use at its peak effort. So if that number is low and we're at peak effort now, we know that our VO2 max takes a precipitous decline as we age. So it's really important to know what it is, or a good ballpark, and to be able to figure out how to strengthen that. And the best way to strengthen that is really through hard aerobic activity, and not a long period of time, but strength training, things that get our heart rates up. So lots of people use high intensity training, or interval training. All these things help to get our VO2 max up. And the more we have it up now at 50 or 60, the better off we'll be when it starts to go down, just by the process of aging when we're 90. So we want a higher O2 max, because it tells our body we're actually being more efficient in the use of oxygen, and helps you perform better in endurance activities and reduces fatigue. So when you see somebody and they are really struggling to walk up a street that is a slight incline, you can probably assume their VO2 max is not great. So we've got to really work on that, strengthening that. And even the Apple Watch, the health app within Apple Watch can give you a good indicator of that. And the second one is the grip straining, and that is the use of our hands and how that really helps us. So a strong grip strength lowers our risk of cardiovascular disease, dementia, and frailty. And one of the easiest ways to start to increase that it's really easy, is just get a towel. And when you're sitting and watching TV, squeeze the towel. I just have a Kleenex, but you get the idea of squeezing the towel. Do it 10 times on each one, or use an apparatus like the one I have pictured here, or one of those little stress balls. Things like that will really help your grip without you having to do a lot of effort. So it's a really easy way to start to increase our grip strength. Okay, so next slide. So here's some functional strength goals that we should all be working on if we want to be that productive 93-year-old. And that's me. I want to be that productive 93-year-old. And here's some goals that you can try. So balancing on one foot for 30 seconds. This is really an easy process to do no matter where we are, right? We can do this while you're standing in line to check out at the grocery store, at the post, anywhere you go. You can practice this. If you're unstable at first, try doing it next to a chair so you have something to hold on to. And then you can, the more you do it, the more your proprioception in your feet start to go, okay, I see I'm not balanced, and it'll start to help you balance. That helps our brain go, okay, this is what it feels like to be balanced. Another one is carry 2 bags of groceries for 50 feet. So grip strength. So if you're walking, divide your groceries into 2 bags and start to carry them. Getting up off the floor without using your hands. It's a real challenge, but it's something that if we start now, you can do easily. And so the action plan may be that you do strength training, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. Squats, push-ups, resistance exercises are really good. We want to make sure that we're increasing the big muscles in our legs, because that helps us with so many things. Our balance, it helps us. If we start to fall, it helps us to catch ourselves. It helps us to, get up off the floor. If you fall and your phone is in the other room, can you get up to get to the phone? And so there's many easy things you can do. These things aren't expensive. You don't have to go to the gym. We can do them right at home. Walking is a great way. So, the 10,000 steps is somewhat of an arbitrary number, but getting typically between 7 to 8,000 a day, 10,000 if you want to, are all really good things to put in your action plan. So as you start to work on these things, you can say, okay, I'm going to do my steps, or I'm going to do strength training a few times a week. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about metabolic and nutritional health. So we know that insulin resistance really accelerates aging. There's been tons of studies that talk about this, and our metabolic health plays a huge role in how well we age. And insulin resistance really accelerates that. And that means our insulin resistance is that our mechanism for how we release insulin after we eat and in a response to glucose is off. And so when that is off, it accelerates everything, because it increases our spikes in glucose and decreases our insulin. And it just starts a cascade of events. So what do we do? What's a strategy? Well, using more of a Mediterranean diet. We all know the blue zones and how we see people that live on these blue zone areas and how they really have a very different dietary pattern. They eat more whole grain foods. They have fiber in them, and they really eat a well-rounded diet. So an action plan is to probably include protein, because we again know that as we age, we tend to eat less and we often forego protein. We're like, I don't really need that much protein. I'm a vegetarian. I've been a vegetarian for 20 years. And so about 10 years ago, I started to add back in fish to my diet because I felt like I wasn't really getting enough protein. So making sure that you're getting enough protein, using healthy fats instead of saturated fats. So fats like olive oil, nuts, fish, fruit, and increase our fiber at the same time. So we want to make sure we know there's a huge relationship between our aging and our gut health. And so it's really important to make sure that we get those healthy fats, decrease our saturated fats. In the US, it's just appalling to me when I just read labels how much stuff has its high amounts of saturated fats. And until you start to kind of become aware of it, and I started to read labels. I'm one of those people in the grocery store, and people are like, oh my God. But I'm reading the labels because it's appalling to me how much saturated fat are in many processed foods and in many foods that we don't even know have it. So making sure we can get those within a reasonable range. The American Heart Association likes you to be under 20. Most cardiologists want you to be under maybe 15 to 10 grams a day. It also depends, it's based on your total caloric intake, so you kind of have to adjust. But a good rule of thumb is to try and stay under about 15 grams of saturated fat a day in your diet. And one of the biggest culprits, and one of my favorite things, is full fat dairy. I love cream in my coffee and the cheeses. So I really have had to modify my diet to make sure that I'm really trying to stay my saturated fats in a reasonable area. I have a terrible family history of cardiac problems, so I'm very mindful of that. If that's not your issue, then just be mindful of it. So each of us have to kind of look at individually what of these things makes sense to us. And that's where the labs come in, of really getting that baseline so you can advocate for yourself with your healthcare providers, but also where you stand and you can champion your own health. Okay, so the next one is sleep. And I talked about this a little bit earlier. Again, I use my Apple Watch to monitor my sleep. And I realized I wasn't nearly getting enough sleep. I thought I was, but I really wasn't getting it. And it wasn't particularly good quality of sleep. So the goal is to aim for 7 to 9 hours asleep. It's essential for both our brain and our heart health. And I've talked to women who have young kids and they're like, you've got to be kidding me, right? And I know that is true. So I try and exclude new moms from this, because you just have that window of time where it's just hardly possible to get any quality sleep. But as we get older, we have more control over that. And poor sleep increases the risk of many things. And one of those particularly is Alzheimer's disease. And so an action plan is to really aim for 7 to 9 hours of sleep, but really have it be good quality sleep. So ways you can do that to reduce screen time. That blue light of screens really keeps our brain stimulated. So when we fall asleep, we don't necessarily get good quality of sleep right away, because if we've been staring at the light. So I've started doing things like I stopped using my phone an hour before I go to bed. I started using an eye mask because I realized that I sleep with my blinds, the windows open, and I wake up. So I started using a mask, and it really has, for me, helped. Sometimes I try and do light stretching. I listen to meditation, things that help me try and get good hours of sleep. I am not a person who sleeps well at all. So I really try and use as many different things as I can to ensure that not only am I just not laying in bed awake at 3 in the morning, but I actually have some quality. So aim for that 7 to 9 hours, reduce that screen time, and maybe do some light exercise, not aerobic, but maybe some light stretching. Listen to a meditation that helps breathing, because all these things will really help. Next slide, please, Mary. Thank you. So emotional and cognitive health are this one is really important, because we often say, okay, we can do the exercise and I can work on my sleep, but really our how we are, the stress in our bodies, in our lives, and our social connections make huge differences in our aging. And they really do contribute to longevity. We know that with dementia, it's one of the main things that we see happening with people that get dementia. They really start to lose their social circle, their social lifespan, if you will. So lifelong learning really helps that, games. So an action plan is to commit to learning something, using your brain, whether it's learning a new language, learning an instrument, learning how to do puzzles. Practice stress management. It really helps. Deep breathing, walking in nature, those kinds of things. Because one of the tests I wanted you to get is to look at your cortisol levels. And we know that when we live in stress, emotional stress, it increases our cortisol level. And what that triggers in our body is the kind of flight or fight response. And it is really bad, because what happens is we see that stress, and our body is always like, should I stay? Should I fight? Should I go? And when you're living in that, it increases our inflammation. It increases our all these different processes that kind of cascade to problems. So action plan, practice stress management, and cultivate strong relationships. We have this amazing opportunity within Falco to have a network of people that are our counterparts, that help us, that really are part of our social scene, that help us to live strong and healthy. Next slide, please. Okay, so stress, cortisol level, and our heart rate variability. Again, and I'm not getting paid by Apple Watch, trust me, but they do, and there's many apps that you can get. You don't have to do that. But when you can manage and look at your heart rate variability, this indicates you want a high heart rate variability. So this means that you have your nervous system recovers better. So when you are stressed, you have a quick ability to be able to recover from that. So the action plan here is to reduce that cortisol. Daily breathing, deep breathing, nature walks, meditation, all these things really, really help us decrease that. And our heart rate variability, aerobic exercise, cold exposure. So you hear a lot about people doing cold plunges. And there is a lot of research that said this really helps us, because what it does is it puts our body in stress, and then we recover. And as we are able to practice that and recover faster, it's better for us. So even though I hate to be cold. I do try and practice it more than I used to, so I can have a way that my body, I can train it to really increase that variability where I have a less cortisol and a high um, heart rate variability, and that really helps. Okay, next slide, please. So the action plan. So exercise and strength training are really important. Try doing, strength training a couple times a week. Aim for walking 7 to 10,000 steps a day. Follow a diet that looks like the Mediterranean diet. Increase your protein and fiber. Reduce processed food, which we are much more able to do, I think, in Europe than in the US. Really prioritize sleep. Reduce the screen time, and engage in those social activities that really help manage stress, commit to lifelong learning, and get your baseline labs done. So next slide, please. So you don't have to pick all of these at once. So pick maybe a couple things that you want to work on in this next year. Commit to 1 or 2 small daily actions. The best way to do this is to not overwhelm yourself, because it can really be overwhelming, because all of a sudden you think, oh my God, what am I going to do? I want to be 90 and doing all these things. So I better run up the hill. I better stop eating this. And you just make yourself crazy. So that's not the goal here. The goal is to really, take these steps, figure out the things that are most important to you. And a great way to do this is to say, what do I want to be doing at 90? What's important to me at that age, and start to focus on those things, because then we can kind of put our own action plan together and guide ourselves. And connect with a friend or Falco member to stay accountable. Sometimes some people like to work very independently, but some people like a buddy, a health buddy, a friend, somebody that they can stay accountable to. Say, hey, what did you do this week? Oh, I didn't do much. Or, hey, I started this. Or for me, I got a bar to do chin-ups. Because there's no way on this green earth that I can do a pull-up now, or a chin-up, or anything close. So I got a bar, and so I'm just started by, I just hang on the bar and work on my grip strength and try and move my feet. So it's easy, because for me, I wanted to make sure I can increase my grip strength. So I did that. So next slide, please, Mary. So I'll share with you, these are the 10 goals that I'm working on that I want to have done within the next year. And I share these because I want accountability from you, my Falco sisters, but I also want you to say, hey, that might work for me. That doesn't work for me. These are all based on one of my favorite physicians, whose name is Dr. Peter Attia, and he wrote a wonderful book called Outlive. Again, no, I have no relationship with them. I just like his work. It's pretty scientific, but it's definitely worth a read. And these are the things that I'm working on. And we've talked about a few of them. Balancing on one foot, getting off the floor without using my hands, and carrying the groceries. I want to walk up and down steps without using a railing. I want to be able to lift 30 pounds over my head. So if I'm on a flight and I'm going to Rome and I'm 90 and I have a little carry-on bag, I want to be able to lift it up and put it in the overhead bin. Deadlift your body 1.5 times your body weight. I haven't started working on that yet, but it's my goal. I want to walk a mile in under 15 minutes, and I can do that most days. I want to be able to open a tough jar and not say to my husband, can you open this, please? And I want to be able to step up onto a 12-inch platform up and down. And that, again, shows me what my overall muscle strength is. and to be able to squat down. And so these are the goals that I have. I've given myself 14 months to try and get to these. And I'll check back with me and I'll let you know how I'm doing. But in the meantime, what I want is for you to be able to figure out what ones you want to do, what makes sense for you, and start. So next slide, Mary, please. So we all have this ability to increase our health span. It doesn't have as much to do with our genetics and the clock ticking as it does about the choices we make. So small actions today, tomorrow, the next day, all make a difference to shape our future. Test your balance. Do that this week. You can get off the call today and stand up and see how long you can balance. Choose one habit, one thing that you want to do, and start it this week. And next slide, please, Mary. So come up with a plan. So do you want to focus on improving your strength? Do you want to adjust your diet for better metabolic health? How's your sleep? If you say, look, I sleep fine, I don't have any problems, okay, check, that's great. But consistent changes really make the biggest impact over time. So you don't have to do everything all at once. And you can just start small. The most important thing is to just start. Okay, Mary, next slide. So how can we as Falco members take action together? Well, we can form a Falco longevity challenge and track our habits together for 30 days. We can share our exercise, nutrition, and health span wins in our community. You know, we can do it anyway. We can create local accountability groups within our own clubs. We can use our Falco resources, which are so abundant for wellness, education, and engagement. So we can take these action steps together. And finally, I just want to say on our last slide that you've got this. You can do this. I'm doing this. We can all do this together. And it's not an impossible dream. It's something that we can all do. So when you think about your future, I want you to really think about, where do I want to be? You know, we all think, oh, I'll just be fine. But then when we start actually thinking about it, think, well, gosh, if I can't walk a mile now, how am I ever going to walk a mile in 20 years? So my goal for you is to start this health journey or expand it and work on mastering the things that you want, so we can all be here in 20 or 30 years having a great conversation. I hope you enjoyed this. And so now this is done for the formal part of the presentation, and we have some time left if we want to have questions. I think Mary's going to stop the recording and we can go from there.